There's a ginger ale made from a natural artesian spring in a town so small that most people drive straight through it without ever touching the brakes. And it is so fierce that it ships with a color-coded warning printed on the cap. The rice dish that half the South spoons onto its plate every New Year's Day was created on the South Carolina coast by people who carried the seeds over from West Africa in their own hands. And the mayonnaise sitting in more southern refrigerators than any other brand, the one folks argue over as though it were a test of character, was dreamed up by a woman in Greenville, South Carolina, who got her start selling sandwiches to soldiers. South Carolina never asked for credit for any of it. Here are 10 foods that prove it never had to. South Carolina sits wedged between two states that soak up all the attention. Georgia gets the peaches, North Carolina gets the barbecue argument, and South Carolina quietly built one of the most consequential food cultures in the country, rooted along the coast and carried inland through 200 years of history that most people have never once been told. From the Gullah Geechee communities of the Lowcountry, who brought their food traditions across from West Africa and built the cuisine the rest of the South would inherit, to a woman in an upstate city who invented the condiment the South runs on while cooking for soldiers during a world war. This is South Carolina's story, and it has waited long enough to be told properly. Coming in at number 10 is a dish you know cold if you're from the right stretch of South Carolina and have almost certainly never heard of if you're not. Chicken bog comes out of Horry County and the Pee Dee region. A whole chicken, smoked sausage, and rice cooked low and slow, together in a single pot until the rice soaks up everything around it. The word bog points to the consistency. It's wet enough that the rice barely keeps its shape. It doesn't look like much, and it tastes like a meal somebody spent the whole day on, because somebody did. The Loris Bogov Festival pulls close to 25,000 people every year into a town of 2,000. 25,000 people descending on a town of 2,000 to eat this dish cooked in enormous pots by folks who've been making it their entire lives. Drive an hour east of Columbia, and chicken bog needs no introduction. Drive an hour west and you'll get a blank stare. That's not a marketing failure, that's simply how regional food behaves when nobody has tried to ship it somewhere it was never invited. And at number 9, we start a thread that's going to run through the next several entries, and it is the most important food story in this state. Benne is the Mende word for sesame. When enslaved West Africans were carried to South Carolina, some of them brought sesame seeds along, hidden in clothing by some accounts, braided into hair by others. The seeds were a food source they recognized, a piece of a life that was being stripped from them, and they held on. Those seeds took root in South Carolina soil. The thin, crisp, sweet and savory Benne wafer that's now a Charleston gift shop staple and the fixture of the city's food identity traces straight back to that act of preservation. The Gullah Geechee communities of the Lowcountry built this tradition. Charleston now sells it in cellophane bags at tourist shops on King Street. The distance between those two facts is what this whole stretch of the list is really about. The seed survived. The tradition survived. What didn't always survive was the acknowledgement of whose tradition it was and who built it. At number 8 is the dish half the South eats at midnight on New Year's Eve without knowing where it came from. Hoppin John is black-eyed peas cooked with rice, fatback or smoked pork, and onion. The black-eyed pea itself is West African in origin. It reached South Carolina the same way the Benne seeds did, carried by Gullah Geechee people who brought their food knowledge across an ocean under conditions no one should ever have to survive. The ritual that gathered around the dish over time spread outward from the South Carolina Lowcountry until it blanketed the entire region. Eat Hoppin John on New Year's Day for luck, collard greens for money, cornbread for gold. Most of the people sitting down to that meal on January 1st in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi are observing a Gullah Geechee tradition from the South Carolina coast that they inherited with no name attached to it. That's what happens when a food culture is built by people who weren't permitted to own what they made. The food travels. The credit stays behind.
Landing at number 7 is where this thread carries its full weight. Red rice is cooked with tomatoes, smoked pork, and onion until the whole pot turns a deep orange red. It's a direct descendant of the West African jollof rice traditions brought to South Carolina by Gullah Geechee people from the rice farming regions of Senegal and Sierra Leone. In the colonial era, the South Carolina Lowcountry was known as the Rice Coast. Rice was the economic engine that made the colony rich. And the knowledge of how to grow it, how to build the irrigation systems, how to process the grain, how to cook it, all of that came specifically from enslaved people who were brought to South Carolina precisely because they already knew how. They built the rice economy. They built the rice cuisine. One of those contributions made it into the history books. The other was handed down in recipes through Gullah Geechee kitchens for 200 years before anyone in a position to write it down decided it was worth naming. Red rice is still on tables all across the Lowcountry. Now you know who built it. Sitting at number 6 is a dish you've almost certainly eaten at a party, and probably never knew the real name of. Frogmore stew is shrimp, corn on the cob, smoked sausage, and potatoes boiled together in one pot with Old Bay seasoning. Outside South Carolina it gets called a Lowcountry boil, a seafood boil, or sometimes a Beaufort stew. The original name is Frogmore, a community on St. Helena Island on the South Carolina coast. A man named Richard Gay of Gay Fish Company is credited with naming the dish and carrying it beyond the island in the 1960s and 70s. He was feeding large crews of workers and needed something that scaled cleanly. One pot, a handful of ingredients, everything finished at once. The dish spread past St. Helena, past the coast, past South Carolina. It's now one of the defining communal meals of the American coastal South. People cook it at beach houses and in backyards from Virginia to the Gulf without knowing its name or its address. The address is Frogmore, South Carolina, on St. Helena Island, and you can look it up. Claiming the number 5 spot is the thing that sets South Carolina apart from every other barbecue state in the country, and I mean that literally. South Carolina is the only state with 4 distinct regional barbecue sauce traditions. Vinegar and pepper in the Pee Dee. A light tomato vinegar sauce in the Piedmont. A heavier tomato base along some of the border areas. And in the Midlands, the one that stops people who've never had it cold. A bright yellow mustard sauce built on vinegar and sugar, with no tomato anywhere near it. This one came from German settlers who arrived in the South Carolina Midlands in the 1700s and brought mustard as their base condiment. The tradition took hold and stayed put. Duke's Barbecue in Orangeburg and Morris's Piggy Park in Columbia are the institutions that carry it. The sauce is tangy and sharp, and it does something to smoked pork that no other sauce pulls off. Most people outside South Carolina have never tasted it. Every other state in the South is still arguing over which single sauce is the right sauce. South Carolina settled that argument by deciding the answer was 4. The one built on mustard is the one worth driving for. At number 4 is a dish that began with a president, a visit, and a man who decided the soup being served wasn't good enough. In 1909, President William Howard Taft came to Charleston. Mayor Goodwin Redd asked his butler, William Diaz, to elevate the crab soup being prepared for the occasion. Diaz folded crab roe into the bisque. The roe deepens the color, thickens the texture, and adds a briny complexity that sets she crab soup apart from any other crab preparation in American cooking. A pour of dry sherry goes in at the end. That part is not optional. Taft loved it. The dish became a Charleston institution. William Diaz was a Gullah Geechee man whose name shows up in most origin accounts, but whose full story has never been told as widely as the dish he perfected. She crab soup is now on upscale menus all over Charleston and is one of the dishes the city is best known for nationally. It was built in a kitchen by a man who was asked to make something better, and did exactly that. That's how Charleston's food history tends to go. Someone makes a decision. The decision outlasts everyone who made it. Landing at number 3 is a bottle that earns its reputation the hard way. Blenheim ginger ale is drawn from a mineral spring in Blenheim, South Carolina, and the red cap version is genuinely spicy. Not ginger ale spicy. Actually spicy. In a way that builds, settles in, and makes you understand exactly why the warning exists. It's still produced, still drawn from that same spring in South Carolina. People order it by mail when they can't find it locally. People drive hours to load up in person. If you've only ever had a national brand ginger ale, you've tasted something merely inspired by the idea of ginger. Blenheim tastes like ginger with something to prove. It's been doing this from the same South Carolina springs since 1903, and it has never once considered toning itself down. And at number 2, we close the Gullah Geechee thread with the dish that traveled furthest from home. Shrimp and grits started out as breakfast shrimp. That was its name, and its whole identity. Fresh shrimp cooked fast and served over coarse stone-ground grits. Shrimp were so plentiful along the South Carolina coast that they were nearly free. Grits were the staple grain. This was practical food, built by people making something good out of what was on hand. The Gullah Geechee communities of the South Carolina Lowcountry built it. It stayed on the coast for generations, largely unknown beyond the region. In 1985, a writer named Craig Claiborne published a piece in the New York Times that lifted it to national attention. A chef named Bill Neal, at a restaurant called Crook's Corner in Chapel Hill, refined it for restaurant service. From there the dish spread to menus in 49 states, and eventually to restaurants in Paris and Tokyo. The people who built breakfast shrimp out of what the coast handed them never saw what it became worth. What they made from shrimp and cornmeal and nothing else is now one of the most reproduced dishes in American restaurant culture. They built this. Everyone else profited. Now at least you know who deserves the credit. At number 1, we go to Greenville, South Carolina, in the year 1917. A woman named Eugenia Duke was making sandwiches in her kitchen to sell to soldiers stationed at Camp Sevier, a World War I training base outside Greenville. Her sandwiches were better than anything else those men could get, and the reason was the mayonnaise she was making herself. It was richer than any commercial version, tangier, no sugar, which was the standard addition at every competitor, and a higher proportion of egg yolks than anything else on the market. It held up through the heat of a South Carolina summer in ways commercial formulas couldn't. Soldiers started asking for the mayonnaise on its own. By 1917, she was selling it bottled. Eugenia Duke's formula has never changed. The company is now owned by Sour Brands, but the recipe in the jar today is the same one she built in her kitchen more than 100 years ago. The cultural attachment that grew up around it is unlike anything else in American condiment history. People get Duke's tattoos. People name businesses after it. People react to the wrong mayonnaise on a sandwich the way most folks react to something genuinely offensive. That's not brand loyalty. That's the relationship a community builds with something it considers part of its own identity. Eugenia Duke needed a mayonnaise that tasted better than everything else on the table. She built one. It became the condiment the South runs on. That's Greenville, South Carolina. That's 1917. And that's what happens when a woman decides something needs to be better and simply makes it so. Sesame seeds carried across an ocean and turned into a Charleston tradition. A mineral spring ginger ale that earns a warning on the cap. The only state in the country with 4 separate barbecue sauce traditions. A man who added crab roe to a soup for a president and built a Charleston institution before anyone bothered to write his full story down. And a woman selling sandwiches to soldiers who built the condiment the South defends like a point of honor. South Carolina never chased recognition for any of it. The Gullah Geechee Lowcountry built more of what the world calls Southern food than it has ever been given credit for. If you grew up in South Carolina and carried any of this with you when you left, you've been carrying something worth knowing. And if this is the first time you've heard any of it said out loud, now you know where to say it came from. Drop a comment and tell me which one surprised you most.